presentation, and it's always a pleasure for me to talk to this great community. And today my talk is on the effects of climate change variability on rural livelihoods in Madre de Dios, Peru. So the presentation is part of a publication that came out recently in June 2020. The publication is recently, but the studies have been done kind of like some years ago, between 2013 and 2015. And this was part of a series of studies that were assigned by the regional government of Madre de Dios within the special project as well called Madre de Dios, and the Madre de Dios consortium, which is funded by at the time was funded by the Initiative for the Conservation of the Andean Amazon, ICA, in the phase 2. And there were other studies as well that were done. Like in my case, I did this study on climate change variability on rural livelihoods with a focus on fire, on burning activities. But there were other studies that were on vulnerability in fisheries, vulnerabilities in the health sector, in the forest sector, and as well in the agrarian sector. Not all of them ended up in publications, but basically in reports for that were used as well for the regional climate change government and regional climate change office that were trying kind of like to figure out what to do with implementing new regulations as well. So we're going to be looking into that a little bit later. But why we should matter? Why should climate variability matter? And just kind of like, let's refresh a little bit why this is so important and why, for example, in the Amazon region, this is so important, right? I think we all know some parts of it, but the Amazon is the largest rainforest on Earth, right? And when healthy, it absorbs billions of tons of carbon dioxide, CO2, a year through the photosynthesis, the process which plants use to convert CO2, right? Energy and as well water into food. And by removing the CO2 from the atmosphere, the Amazon helps actually to balance and regulate the temperatures, right? So if these cycles get disrupted, and that's what has been happening, then of course, then we will have one of these extreme events. And the Amazon region, not only in the Peruvian Amazon, but all over, they have already experienced very extreme climatic events, such as droughts, for example, the droughts of 2005, the droughts of 2010, and then there was as well a minor drought in 2015, and as well as flooding, and all these disruptions in the climates, they have caused a lot of vulnerabilities in the fishing, agriculture, and human health sectors. What main science kind of like, we always kind of like try to analyze the effects of climate, like climate temperatures are higher, temperatures are lower, but we don't really actually go into much deeper what are the effects really on livelihoods activities, and especially in regions where the vulnerability is very high, right? So what we know, and as well this graph here that you can see in front of you, which is a more recent publication as well from 2009, they actually show the decline of moisture in the air over the Amazon rainforest, and how it has declined over from 1987 to 2016. So there is a trend going on, okay? and the trend is going to continue. So the cases of temperatures and precipitation anomalies are going to continue. Models show that, and as this graph is shown, the trends of precipitation, of having a greater variability in rainfall and drier summers in the tropics, can be and are already very devastating, and as a consequence, we are seeing more droughts and floods as well, events, and especially those are kind of like very abrupt changes that makes the difference. So that's why in the Amazon region, we who have been working on this study, we think that climate change really matters, and because we need a better, improved understanding on damages caused to people, property, and livelihoods, and in order to get into policy and action, right? So this is kind of like what motivated us as well to engage in this study. And of course, there's variability in climate and there is vulnerability as well, okay? And when there are these changes that I just explained briefly, there is vulnerability. And communities, they face extreme climatic events, such as the droughts and the flooding. And a lot of these communities, they depend on the level of vulnerability, right? The level of vulnerability is based on the intensity of the event, the degree of exposure, and the response and capacity, right? A community's vulnerability fluctuates over time and is driven by a lot of other factors. They can be all interrelated, but they're like economic, social, cultural, and demographic factors in nature. So there is this high level of vulnerability, which is often the result of a very uneven development processes in the region, and as well the lack of state policies, and as well the lack or void of support of the communities living in those regions that lead to higher exposure, to higher or lack of response capacity as well during the disasters, right? And then there is fire as well, okay? This is, this lack of response as well is particularly problematic as well in light of rural livelihoods in the tropics, where there is an established cultural practice involving the use of fire, right, for land management and soil productivity. And so, whereas historically the use of fire served to increase soil fertility and for planting, right, and of food crops to support the livelihoods of the people living in the areas, now at this time, under the conditions that I just kind of like presented and laid out, in the condition of this climate extreme, such as the droughts, using fire, right, aggravates the risk of major disasters and increases this vulnerability that we're trying to kind of like to grasp what it is. And so it is when fire escapes, or natural fire escapes, it controls, I suppose, a serious risk as well to all the natural resources around, and especially in households that are resource dependent, and that's the way that the community subsist on natural resources, right? So here fire is so problematic, and we need to understand fire under these new perspectives with different eyes, okay? So that's why our study argued that because of this increased variability, fires will and are already constituting a threat to the populations that by other means, they already face other types of vulnerabilities, right? And they try to secure their own sustainable livelihoods. So they are being threatened, and their livelihood activities are being threatened, and all their forest products extraction, their crop cultivation, livestock ranching, timber extraction, and even fishing, all those can be put in the same pot that are going to be affected and are already being affected. And this was kind of like as well our objectives as well, with this in mind, right? The objectives of our study of the research that we did, we wanted to analyze how climate-related variability affects different livelihood activities involving management of natural resources in Madre de Dios. In other words, we wanted to know how the different sectors, economic sectors, are being affected. And the key question is, what are the effects of extreme climatic events on different livelihood activities in communities located across Madre de Dios in Peru? And our work is based on the theoretical framework of livelihood vulnerability to climate change. Vulnerability studies, they give us more information on how people's changing circumstances may leave them less able to cope effectively to environmental and social change. It's basically on the Adgar has written a lot about these aspects on vulnerability studies. And vulnerability has as well a lot of components, right? It includes the susceptibility of exposure to the potential harm as well, and as well the response capacity after exposure. And I would like to kind of like give a little bit more insights into this, because that's kind of like very important. So in the figure here by Thomas in 2019, vulnerability here is a function of exposure, right? Sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is low, that is low relative to exposure, and sensitivity contributes to high vulnerability, right? By contrast, here down below, a higher adaptive capacity helps reduce the effects of exposure and sensitivity, and in turn reduce the vulnerability. So please try to keep this in mind as well in terms of analyzing as well the effects of policies or demanding as well better policies. We need to kind of like be working more in this realm of adaptive capacity, right? In order to decrease the level of exposure and sensitivity, right? And just by kind of like having then this as an idea, vulnerability is then as well synonymous to openness, defenselessness, exclusion, deficiency, and inability of communities when disasters strike. So this all is kind of like interrelated. So we are all kind of like trying to learn more and understand more this kind of like stages of defenselessness, of weaknesses, right, and deficiency. So I was kind of like trying to relate this as well with marginality, adaptability, fragility, and risk, but at the same time, this diversity of applications of vulnerability has led to kind of like this constellation of these related concepts, and conceptual advances in vulnerability analysis, they have as well led to the identification of other factors like biophysical, social, economic, and political factors. All are part, as well, these kind of like across scales as well, are all affecting the level of vulnerability, no? And so in order to kind of like to insert our study into this approach, for us, a key consideration then is to understand climate change in this case, not only is kind of like, is there like higher temperatures or lower temperatures? No, it's a threat to a rural livelihood and perceptions of environmental risk among local peoples. So how they are depending on heavily natural resources extractions to survive, and their levels of vulnerabilities in attaining this. So this is kind of like how we were basing our research, right? We wanted to have a better understanding of the cultural and the social dimensions, and by grasping this vulnerability of the livelihood activities, right? And so a very huge understanding is kind of like the cultural practices. And I'm gonna come back to the cultural practices when I discuss a little bit more about the role of fire, right? The cultural practices, they are rooted in these prevailing modes of production, consumption, and social organization. And that's where we have to kind of like get our better understanding of this, right? So let's get into this a little bit more, what the role of fire is there. One example of practice of burning in the Amazon is this part of slash and burn subsistence agriculture, right? Fire or controlled burning, this is kind of like very common for a common technology for land conversion and soil management, right? I think this is kind of like very common, but fire is essential in that regard as for the process to converting the vegetation to improved soil fertility. But what we need to now understand is that, however, in this context of climate change, fire has become a social and environmental problem. And in the role of fire, right, in these Amazonian communities, it's the same. It hasn't changed. The way that the cultural practices hasn't decreased, and it's gonna be very hard to break it down, right? It is a well-established cultural practice, and as well on top of as well that there has been kind of like a lot of increased expansion of cropland and livestock as well along highways and its major development processes, and that as well has increased the occurrence of fire. So there is the on one side the practical culture practice of fire, and on the other side, of course, this burning down what we have experienced basically in the past 2 years, more extensive burning in the Amazon because of expansion of high level activities, right? And soya and livestock and as well agriculture. So getting this into the context, right? I just wanted to mention that although fire is kind of like very important, our focus in our study is not specifically studying the burning hotspots in Madre de Dios, but it was very important for us to understand that. So we actually did a small analysis and trying to localize the 2005 and 2010 burning scars, and basically those happened along the interoceanic highway in Madre de Dios, right? You can see that here, that and those were as well correlated with deforestation areas. So these are kind of like the pixel distribution between 2000 and 2012, and they were correlated with as well expansion of agriculture, but as well where most of the farmers were living as well, right? So although then we focus on the effects of extreme climate events on livelihood activities at the community and individual levels, our understanding or our study or analysis, it's looking for how these research management practices become become a potential threat to the context of climate variability, right? The fieldwork design of our studies was focused on representatives of communities, particularly vulnerable along this corridor of the interoceanic highway. Representatives as well linked to the agricultural sectors, which was extractive sectors, agriculture, fisheries, agroforestry, rubber industry, forestry, and Brazil nut extraction sectors, which we can see. Well, these are kind of like the burst, yeah, which is basically here. In Brazil nut, you will see here, these are the small holder agriculture farming activities, and then we have the concessions, forestry concessions as well. Just to make sure that our study did not include any studies along the mining concession, because that was gonna, we did it on purpose. We completely omitted the mining sector because there was gonna be kind of like a completely different study with different categories that we needed to include. So, but I think it's very important as well in the future to include definitely as well this type of studies in with considering the mining concession. So in the Peruvian Amazon, we know the major productive activities consist of the slash and burn, subsistence agriculture, basically along the highway, which is mainly rice, beans, and maize, forest extractions, and to a lesser extent, cattle ranching, although that's increasing as well. And although the agriculture activities, they provide mostly poor economic returns to the farmers, but subsistence agriculture is crucial for their livelihood still to this point, okay? So the basic extractive economic activities are subsistence and some industrial farming as well, cattle runs, cattle grazing, fishing, and the production of timber and non-timber forests, as I mentioned, such as rubber and Brazil nut, right? I just want to go back to, I'm sorry that we did our studies here in along the highway, and basically in the towns of Iberia, Alegría, Planchón, Puerto Maldonado, Laberinto, and Masuco. And we did as well several workshops in these areas. So that kind of like this was basically our focus of study. So we interviewed key informants, right, linked to specific organizations that represented the key smallholder livelihood activities. And there was a little bias, conscious bias towards representatives who would have a longer understanding and knowledge as well in which to place their more recent experiences. So for example, they needed to have experienced the drought of 2005. They needed to have be present as well in 2010. But I think that was kind of like our conditions as well. We interviewed in total 77 people. Out of them there were 14 women and 63 men. And this was done between 2013 and 2014. No, most of the representatives, they were representing federations, they were producer associations, institutions dealing as well with environmental topics, and like NGOs and natural resources. In addition, we interviewed as well representatives of stakeholder groups of the private and public sector, community forest users, non-government organizations, right, and as well from academia, research, and the education community, like school teachers and so on. We as well interviewed some of the households affected by the droughts and fires, and we further organized as well workshops, participatory workshops in Iberia. You can see them here, in Alegría, in Puerto Maldonado, and Lago Valencia. Lago Valencia is not part of this. And this were done in 2014. And as well to account for gender, and as well this proportional impact of climate change on women, we specifically organized as well a workshop for only women, for 28 female leaders from different organizations and communities, and that was done in Puerto Maldonado. For the data collection, okay, we included questions to permit our analysis, right, on the vulnerability of livelihood activities. And we obtained information, I'm sure, like this is kind of like to give you an idea of all kind of like the different information that we were collecting, but we obtained information on the knowledge of their own and knowledge of climate change, on the impact of climate change on the different livelihood activities, on existing laws and regulations, on the social aspects of learning, the questionnaires. They included as well some items or perceptions of risk in light of the climate change and the threats that they perceived on themselves, in their household, at the household levels, and as well at their sector level, right? The second part as well asked information relevant to the response capacity to disasters, disaster risk reduction, and capacity building. And further, we ask as well questions about social and environmental vulnerability and the specific circumstances of communities and how that influenced perception of risk and extreme climatic events of fires, variations as well in access to information on climate change, and means of communication was very important as well. We were also interested in identifying how they endured the extreme climatic events, especially the 2005 and the 2010 drought, and For some questions, the respondents, they were asked to choose from specific answers or specific options, but they could as well provide their own words. And we included as well an open-ended section in which respondents, they were free to express their perspectives and on the topics in question. So it was really a mix, with a lot of information that we spent a good 3 hours sometimes with these questions. And then as well, in the workshops, we kind of had as well more information of data collection. And the workshops so included participatory activities, right? And we produced their vulnerability risk maps and calendar of livelihood activities and other extreme events. So it was basically a participatory event with a lot of kind of like drawings and exercises and activities, so that we could kind of like assess as well their information. So as you can tell and you can see, we post a lot of questions, right? So I'm not going to be able to present now all the results of our report at the time in our publication, but I'm going to present the results that are most relevant, of course, and based on a set of figures that draw on how the respondents and workshop participants see extreme events affecting their livelihoods, right? First, we're going to present extreme climatic events to identify which respondents perceived as most threatening. No? And for example, here, these are graphs of major climatic threats faced by the participants, right, according to the interviews. And for example, here, this figure shows that the majority of interviews, they listed several threats, such as high temperature, almost 51%, less than that, torrential rain and high winds, as well as extreme droughts and variations in cold fronts, floods, and river sedimentation, among other events that affected their livelihood activities. And you can see that fire here is still kind of like at the end, but it is still kind of like very important. But I wanted to show as well that not only fire was very important, but as well the increase of hurricane winds. That increase, for example, this is corroborated by a study from ACA, and they basically did a lot of analysis as well with satellite images. And between 2005 and 2017, and you can tell that basically between 2013 and 2015, or 2013 and 2014, there was a huge increase in high winds that could be seen in images like these. Of course, they were using, this is an image by drone, they were using this other technologies that, of course, we did not use, and it was not intentional as well. But I think it gives us as well another perspective that it's not only fires that are affecting, but as well these high winds that, like when I was living in Puerto Maldonado, there were like several times that the winds were really kind of like hurricane style of winds. So we also presented participants with a list of natural resources that had been impacted by extreme climatic events. Here, for example, we present whether respondents rated the likely impacts as very important, important, or less important. Respondents, as you can see, indicated that access to water, food and biodiversity faced the most important threats, followed by concerns about fires, forest fires, and forest production, damage to property, reduced soil, and reduced soil productivity alterations. So respondents understood that climate change posed a threat to the natural resources and on which their livelihoods is depending. So this is kind of like, it is happening and they were already feeling it, right? So now this is kind of exactly results from the workshops, right? These are the seasonal calendars of activities, and we wanted to better understand how these climatic events are related to their key livelihood activities. So as well considered in the respective timing, right, according to to their own annual agricultural calendar. So this figure here, the calendar, presents information about the timing, and the key moments in the calendar for the specific agricultural activities like livestock, agricultural livestock slash cut burn, when they harvest, when the Brazil nut collection is, and as well agriculture and fish ponds. So we performed the interviews for this in 2013. So this data that we see here is basically major events experienced by the participants in 2013, right? By month, and as well compared with the reported seasonal livelihood activities by the sectors. So what is interesting, slash and burn, right? Activities fall into the same months when respondents reported drought, fires, right here, drought, right here, drought and fire, in high-speed wind event as well, suggesting here as well an increase in the vulnerability level for the agricultural activities. In addition, respondents reported as well intense rain and flooding events during the same month as well for harvesting Brazil nut, here, rain and Brazil nut, fish ponds, small livestock, right, and maize and runs. So that you can tell here that there are already different extreme climatic events in different parts of the year that affect different livelihood activities, right? And we then focus on the damage caused by fires. Here in this figure, we provide a list of items related to activities, livelihood activities that could be damaged or were damaged by fires. We asked here interviews to list the most significant damage associated with burning events and rank them on a scale of very strong, and less strong, right? And respondents, they indicated the strongest impact on fires on crops, loss of crops, followed by animals, loss of animals, and as well tree plantations and forests. The strongest damage at the very strong level, mentioned the most, was loss of crops, followed by loss of animals, damage to plantations and agroforestry, and damage to forests, right? And strong damage was as well mentioned for infrastructure. This is the vulnerability matrix of climate disturbances and livelihood practices. So the participants during the workshops, we constructed as well this vulnerability matrix that crossed various extreme climatic events with livelihood activities. So they indicated whether an extreme climatic event had a high, a medium, a low impact on their livelihood activities. And this shows the perceptions of their vulnerability, right? They, as you can see, they did not consider flood, kind of like flooding and cold, high winds or high temperatures to have a high impact. But on many aspects of livelihood system. However, they did indicate high impacts, right, on droughts and fires, on livelihoods in general, and as well on agriculture and livestock, timber, Brazil nuts in particular. They also considered heavy rains to have high impact on livelihoods, agriculture, fishing, and local infrastructure. Interesting, participants considered that the most type of extreme climatic events impacted livelihoods in general, including events that did not have high impacts on specific livelihood activities. We thought that this was kind of like a nice way, and it was a very nice experiment as well during the workshops to get their feedback and as well to discuss how they perceived this. Overall, we think that there is a clear indication on the vulnerability to specific livelihoods activities to climate change. We think were the results from our studies. Here, this figure assesses the respondents' appraisal on vulnerability of livelihood practices based on direct experience, and we asked them to rank them on a scale of very vulnerable, and less vulnerable, right? Here, respondents, they revered agriculture as the most vulnerable activity, livelihood activity. But remember that I was explaining at the beginning as well that although the sector is not as strong as in Madre de Dios in terms of revenues, a large percentage of the population still depends on agriculture. And furthermore, Brazil nuts and livestock and aquaculture are perceived as highly vulnerable as well. So what are the ramifications of extreme climatic events then for people and their livelihoods? And I'm gonna give you like a little bit here of, it's kind of like a lot of information in this graph, in this figure here, but this should give us an idea of how the impacts actually have changed and increased from the time that we did the study for the past 5 years and 10 years. So what we can say is that according to our studies and our findings, there are explicit related extreme climatic events that impacts livelihoods. And this as well correlates with other results presented for other Amazonian regions, we think, okay. There is this increasing high temperatures, there is the diminishing access to water and food, loss of crops and animals are all parts of the respondents that are linked as well to livelihood activities, right? On the spread of fire, in our study, I think that the main cause is still uncontrolled fires from agriculture activities and livestock activities. And that was as well backed up by almost half of the respondents, and who believes that the cases in which burning had become out of control had increased because of lack of knowledge of how to handle actually fire during extremely dry conditions, right? So accidents caused by burning also represents an increased risk, according to our interviews, as well resulting in the deterioration of health, right, which is as well mentioned in this graph, and as well caused by smoke and air pollution and the loss of biodiversity, and as well loss of soil qualities. Their interviews, they reiterated many times as well that they're concerned about economic losses in agricultural productivity, Brazil nut and tree yields, their timber plantations, and as well damage to their own farm infrastructures was very high, right? So the communities and sectors are subject to changes in their access to natural resources impacted by these dramatic events, climate variability. Vulnerability is keenly felt in the subsistence agriculture economy, right? Communities are being exposed to a loss of crops, loss of animals, and there is this drastic reductions in precipitation and water levels and rivers and creeks and fishing patterns. So this is kind of like everything is within the sector in terms of the sectors, the events, the uncontrolled fires, high intense rain, the impacts, and as well the timing. So what is the need? And we need to really to focus on fire as the key factor that links climate change to livelihood. I think this is kind of like what is the take home message from the studies, right? Fire is a key factor, right? Burning regulations exist, but they are not properly implemented. The relevant regulations and standards on forest fires and burnings have not been fully adopted by the populations, and sanctions do not really apply in a timely manner. Fires not only escape into pastures and other burned land, but as well due to the increased dry conditions in adjacent deforested land, the fires, they can escape as well in a more easier way. So we need improved fire management capacity training. Fire has gone from being a benefit under traditional practices crucial to soil fertility and crop production to a major threat now under the climate change scenarios, and thus drought escapes. Its fires are now so easily escaped and out of control, and can destroy capital and resources and property and life. And so what about policies and institutions? I don't know how my time is, but the regional government of Madre de Dios is an important institution, and they're generating a lot of climate strategies using fires and databases and management and training farmers, etc. But it is not enough. For stakeholders, when we asked them whether the institutions to which they belong were acquiring knowledge and training for better improved preparedness against the possible future climate, they say that yes. However, a lot say that they still perceived a lack of technical preparedness and as well a lack of commitment on the part of their authorities. They say as well that their communication networks were poor, and most communication efforts occurred by radio and phone, but they would not reach the most vulnerable, right? The the respondents, they had as well a desire to obtain more information, more training, and on existing laws, and as well on fireman techniques, right? And according to the sectors, so the sectors, they acknowledge, they know that they need to incorporate climate change adaptation mechanism into their agendas. And just kind of like to give you a little bit very brief, over the past 10 years, actually, Peru has generated a lot of very good climate change related documents, okay? However, it was not until April in 2018 that a new climate change law came into existence. And in the past, individual documents existed, such as action plans and strategies, guidelines, and policies. Like, for example, this document that we produced here were part of, we're going to help one of the strategies for the regional strategies and are in 2015. So there were information, but a big step, we think, and I think, was Peru's climate action passing in 2018, because under this new law of 2018, they would provide climate adaptation and mitigation solution via binding legal instruments. That's kind of like the major change, and they would call as well for more participatory, transparent, and integrated climate governance, okay? And as well, the law distinguish as well the role of voices of the indigenous communities and civil society within climate change, which is kind of like a big change as well. But at the regional level, policies and strategies, they are still kind of like being drafted, but it is a first step. And I think they're kind of like progressing. It's continuing. And
I'll ask you to stop there. We are a few minutes over time. I sent you a few chats, but I know sometimes people don't see them while they're presenting. But
yeah,
I'll still ask, and unless you want to say anything just to wrap everything up really quickly, we can start to take any questions.
Yeah, well, maybe just kind of like the recommendations as well, that it's on the policy level, the implementation on policies in the future as well, the regional policies, they need to kind of like focus more on these sectoral and smallholder knowledges, and to increase the capacity of especially people kind of like adapt to these new changes to come as well. And as well, a new, what we need as well is to report on non-climatic drivers of vulnerability, like, for example, economic distress, food insecurity, health marginalization, livelihood diversification, and cultural behavior. So yeah, I kind of like wanted to end. And yes, and that there is extreme climatic events coming, and these are already having a big impact on local livelihoods. And sorry that I went over.